growing in gardens across the Mediterranean for 2,000 years that archons cannot enter. Not avoid. Cannot enter. The frequency this plant produces in physical space is incompatible with archon operation at a fundamental level. Chosen ones who grow it in their homes create a field condition around themselves that the archon harvesting system has no mechanism to penetrate. Not because of folk belief, not because of tradition, because of what the plant actually does to the ambient frequency of the space it inhabits. Jesus knew this plant. He named it directly. In the Gospel of Luke, in a passage that has been read for 2,000 years without most chosen ones recognizing what he was actually describing. One word, one plant. The only plant Jesus names by name in any gospel in direct connection with spiritual practice. Tonight you learn which plant it is, why archons cannot operate in its frequency, and how to grow it, starting this week, so that every space you inhabit becomes a field the archon system cannot reach. Before I give you the plant, you need to understand why Luke 11:42 is the most overlooked frequency teaching in the entire gospel record, and why the plant Jesus names in it has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. Luke 11:42. Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, the religious establishment that had converted spiritual practice into legal performance. He says, "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God." Most readers of this passage focus on the rebuke, Jesus criticizing the Pharisees for obsessing over the tithing of small things while neglecting larger things. And the rebuke is real, but inside the rebuke is something else, a specific named list of plants that the Pharisees were treating as spiritually significant enough to tithe. Mint, rue, every herb. Jesus does not say the Pharisees were wrong to consider these plants spiritually significant. He says they were wrong to prioritize the tithing of them over justice and love. The spiritual significance of the plants is assumed. The error is in the priority, not in the recognition. Of the three named, mint, rue, every herb, rue is the one that stands apart. Mint is common. Every herb is a category. But rue, Ruta graveolens, is the specific named plant, the one Jesus chose to name by name rather than by category. In a gospel where Jesus almost never names specific plants, the naming of rue in this passage is precise and intentional. Rue has been used in the Mediterranean spiritual tradition longer than Christianity itself. In the Roman tradition, it was called the herb of grace, herba gratia, the plant that carried divine favor in physical form. In the early Christian communities of the Mediterranean, it was placed at doorways and windows specifically to prevent the entry of harmful spiritual presences, not as superstition, as a practice rooted in the recognized frequency properties of the plant itself. The tradition that a plant named by Jesus in a spiritual context and used by early Christians for protection carries something real in its physical frequency. Tonight, you learn exactly what that something is. Second element, why archons specifically cannot operate in rue's frequency field, and what the Gospel of Philip tells us about the relationship between certain plants and pneuma frequency in the material world. The Gospel of Philip contains a passage that most translations render as an agricultural metaphor, but that Gnostic scholars increasingly read as a literal frequency teaching. Philip writes that the world came about through a mistake, that whoever created it wanted it imperishable and immortal, but failed, and that certain things in the material world, specific created forms, retained more of the original pneuma frequency than the demiurge intended. Plants that were created before the demiurge's intervention in the original creation carried original source frequency that the demiurgic construction did not fully overwrite. Rue is one of these plants. Its biochemical profile is unlike almost any common garden plant. It produces alkaloids and aromatic compounds that have no clear survival or reproduction function from a standard evolutionary perspective. The compounds exist. They produce measurable effects on human neurological and sensory systems. And they produce a specific aromatic frequency in physical space, the characteristic sharp, bitter, penetrating scent of rue that is the material world expression of the pneuma frequency the plant retained from before the demiurgic construction. Archon operation requires a specific ambient frequency condition. The archon harvesting system functions optimally in spaces where the frequency is dominated by ego construction outputs, fear, distraction, desire, the standard demiurgic ambient. Rue's physical frequency, its scent, its bioelectric field, its presence in a space, introduces a competing frequency that is incompatible with the archon operating ambient. Not because Rue attacks archons, because Rue's pneuma frequency is the same frequency that archons are designed to harvest, and that they cannot manipulate from within. A field that already contains pneuma-level frequency in ambient form has no deficit for archons to exploit. The harvesting mechanism finds nothing to work with. This is why early Christian communities placed Rue at their entries, not as a magical ward, as a frequency condition setter, a way of establishing pneuma frequency as the baseline ambient of the protected space before any chosen one entered it. The plant doing passively what the chosen one's practice does actively. The home's frequency set before the day begins. The Pharisees tithed it because they recognized it was spiritually significant. Jesus named it because it was. The tradition of 2,000 years of Mediterranean chosen ones growing Rue for protection is not superstition that survived. It is knowledge that survived in the form that knowledge survives best, as practice, as tradition, as the habit of growing one specific plant that the people who understood frequency knew to grow. Third element, the practical frequency architecture, where to place Rue in your home to establish maximum pneuma frequency ambient, and why placement matters as much as presence. Rue is a hardy perennial. It grows in pots, it grows outdoors. It grows in low light and in full sun, and in conditions that kill more delicate plants. The demiurge did not make it fragile. It was designed, in the original creation, to persist in the material world regardless of conditions, the pneuma frequency it carries needing to remain available even in